Out on my computer. All right, well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Thomas Norman. I'm at California State University, Dominguez Hills, and I'm excited to be presiding over the final symposium of this LERA program. It's been a good, rich program, and I think we're going to continue the trend with at least one good paper. So I'm going to just introduce the folks, even though I've received word that Arvind Karunakaran from McGill is not going to be able to share a presentation with us today for personal reasons. But having looked at Truce structures, mechanisms for addressing proactive jurisdictional conflicts between professions, I encourage folks to follow that work. We do have the honor of having Silvia from American University here, who will be spending time with us discussing union organizing, public relations firms, and outside consultants, the experience of the United Auto Workers, which I think I'm very interested in that PR connection with unions, given the recent successes we've seen. And then I don't see that we have Aibak here currently, but we'll stay tuned, and there will be time should he come from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to discuss how employee demographics influence arbitration outcomes, some great evidence from the securities industry discrimination complaints. So with that said, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Thomas.
Please share your screen as desired.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak. I know we're at the end, but I think one of the things with virtual conferences is you probably get a few more people even when you're the last paper, although I'm speaking to you from outside of Washington, and it's a beautiful day. So depending on where people are, that could affect attendance on what the weather is. So the title of my paper, as Thomas said, is Union Organizing, Public Relations Firms, and Outside Consultants, the Experience of the United Auto Workers. And this is a little vignette that I found when I was doing research for my forthcoming book. My forthcoming book will appear at Cornell University Press early next year. And the title of that book is United Auto Workers Attempts to Organize Foreign Vehicle Plants in the South. And so I do a comprehensive study. I look at 16 different organizing drives in the book from 1989 up to 2019. And so this is just a little side thing that I found that I thought was very interesting. I spent a lot of time in the UAW archives, which are at Wayne State University in the Walter Reuther Library. And one of the things that was interesting about it is the library had managed to catalog and put in folders everything up to Owen Bieber, but then up to that, the UAW presidents after that, they just had them in boxes. And the boxes had all sorts of interesting names like Boathouse, because on the UAW property, there's this boathouse that's there. They don't use it for boats, they put presidential papers in there. And so there'd be like Boathouse 8, Boathouse 9 for these boxes. And the archivist was very kind to let me go through the raw material before they had processed it. And the results are this paper that you see the PowerPoint for today. So the thing that I'm going to focus on is, I mentioned, I'm looking at this chunk of time for the UAW. And I have a subsection of it here. I'm focusing on the period here between, when you look at the graph, between 1979, when the UAW membership was at a peak of over 1.5 million, And then the years after that, from about 1980 to 1995, when the union first ran into massive membership loss. So this paper is focusing on how did the union leadership deal with that? How did they approach it? And one of the things that I do want to say is I think a common story, if you read the academic literature, if you read labor notes or anything like that, is a story of complacency. But the more that I've dug into this, the less complacency I see that that the union leadership in the time period that I'm going to look at here and in the broader time period that I look in the book, it clearly sees a problem, focuses on the problem, does a lot of experimentation, and it doesn't always work. More often than not, it doesn't work. But you can criticize the UAW leadership, but I don't think complacency is one that would be valid. So just reminder, of course, this isn't any news to anybody here. When you look at the phases of the UAW organizing, that in the 1930s, it was very much either people setting up tables outside factories, or the famous Battle of the Overpass with Walter Reuther and Richard Frankenstein getting roughed up by stooges hired by Ford. So that it was a tough, difficult physical organizing in the 30s. 1940s was a very different story with the War Labor Board. It was more of a government agency that really facilitated organizing. When you get the biggest surge in unionization in the US is in those War Labor Board years. And then, at least in the auto sector, you get a bit of a settling in from the 50s to the 70s. The big three, or there was more than big three then, of course, but the major auto companies were all organized. The UAW had neutrality agreements, and the entire industry was organized. So the UAW really didn't have to do all that much organizing. It did some on the fringes. It's in the 60s when aerospace, actually beginning in World War II, but there was some expansion in aerospace organizing. You did get the parts plants, which have always been a challenge. But in this period, one can say, I think fairly, that the UAW had some atrophying in engaging in grassroots type organizing. Now, when we go into the 80s, we have the arrival of Japanese producers, starting with Honda in Marysville, Ohio, and then followed soon after that by Nissan in Smyrna, Tennessee, Toyota in Georgetown, Kentucky, and then the Subaru Isuzu America plant, which is now a Subaru plant that's in Lafayette, Indiana. So two of these are in the South, two of these are not. And this began to pose a problem for the UAW in trying to figure out how to deal with this. That, as some of you may know, the initial drives that the UAW attempted, one of them, the drive at Marysville, Ohio, fell apart in 1986. That the union recognized that they were not going to win the election, and they withdrew their petition to have a recognition election in 1986. And then in 1989 was the first election at Nissan in Smyrna, Tennessee, and the union lost that election 2-1. And so at this point, for the UAW leadership, it became very clear that they had a problem and that they really needed to address this problem of how do you organize these plants in new places that they've had trouble, started to have trouble organizing. So you began to get some thinking going on within the organization. Leonard Page, for example, the chief counsel for the UAW at the time, made a a memo that has 10 points and suggested different ideas about how to change organizing, and and really focused on the idea of setting up a new UAW Department of Organizing that would be a clear department that had responsibility for organizing, and eventually, not too soon afterwards, you had the UAW also set up a new division that would go along with the Ford, Chrysler, and GM divisions. It would be a transplant division, as they're commonly called. They called it the Transnational and Joint Ventures Department. So that was one thing. This was also a period when the UAW was having a profound rethink, and beginning in about a year and a half before June 1989, this followed from their 86 convention, that the UAW had a whole commission, a big commission that had leadership, that had regional representation. And this commission traveled around the country and spoke to UAW members, and ultimately produced this report, the report of the Commission on the Future of the UAW, A Strong Union in a Changing World. And it was interesting reading this report, and it was very clear that there was a recognition of the difficulties that the union had. And one of the things that in one of the chapters where they talked about the image of the union, and they did a lot of polling, and they recognized that the image of the union was at the time largely a negative image. It was a union that was seen that struck. It was a union that, and it was also a union that was seen as xenophobic. Some of you, if you're old enough, you may remember the incident when UAW members smashed a Japanese car with sledgehammers and other equipment in the parking lot of the UAW headquarters. And so this image, this negative image, they recognized as a problem, as a serious problem to promote, to advance organizing. And so there was also a yearning to adopt the latest technology in 1989, and that is, to promote the union through a lot of they were thinking of is cable television programs, local cable television programs, and other mechanisms. This is there was just the beginnings of the internet. The internet actually came later than 1989, so it doesn't figure in this report. And then and the other part that they were looking at is the idea of doing more polling, that they found the polling that came out of this report was very helpful, and that this would help them advance the union. So once this report was done, there were steps to try to enact the pieces of the report. It was ratified at the union's 1989 convention. And one of the things that they did is they, for the first time, approached public relations firms. And so they approached a public relations firm, and they ended up settling on, at first, on this firm called Laird, Long, and Sylvester. And so they talked to them beginning in March, and this would be the leadership right under Owen Bieber. Dick Shoemaker was the principal. He was Owen Bieber's right hand in this whole process. And so they talked to them, and by the time they sort of engaged them and wanted a proposal. And in early 1992, they got a whopper of a proposal, a 123-page proposal. And not only did it have that, it had an 4-foot by 8-foot chart with a whole set of goals that they were supposed to achieve. And Laird, Long, and Sylvester also proposed a budget for this public relations campaign that would be a little less than $5 million. And their proposal was to really go national, was in a lot of ways, was the essence of their proposal. And they also focused locally, that, that there would be simultaneous community campaigns trying to influence the public relations in the communities in Marysville, Ohio, in Smyrna, Tennessee, and in Georgetown, Kentucky. And this would involve approaching civil society leaders, church pastors, organizational groups, different types of organizations. Some of them would be more worker oriented, but others even, talk to the local chamber of commerce. And a focus on the media was a very important piece of this. And they produced a campaign Bible, which is a 40-page document, and a set of rules of engagement that were really training documents for the national leadership and the local leadership of the union. And they developed 52 strategies. That was why they needed an 8-foot-long chart. They grouped them into market research, public relations, and then sales and advertising. And so this was the proposal. And the theme was the new UAW. The idea was the UAW had this negative image, had this image that was associated with strikes and as I said, a xenophobic image. But instead, what they wanted to do is give the UAW the image. The quote I have here is to depict the UAW as an upbeat, positive American institution with significant experience, wisdom, and resources. The one thing I do have to say is in this proposal, the underlying of American was very stark, that the idea of making it clear that the UAW is American was, and that its achievements were American, was an essential piece of this proposal. Well, what happened was the UAW leadership had some skepticism. So they went to a second group, and this group had, it was actually 3 different organizations. GGM, which was a public relations group, and then the other groups were specialized. The November group was a polling group, and LL, they were also a public relations group. The thing that these 3 groups had that Laird, Long, and Sylvester did not have is the 3 groups that made a second proposal had a long track record of working with unions and working with prominent Democratic Party politicians. And so the UAW leadership took that Laird, Long, and Sylvester proposal. They gave it to the second group and said, what do you think of it? And they had a fairly heavy critique. They did list some positives at first. They said the focus on community was good. The emphasis on trying to do a positive shaping of media coverage was a good direction to go in. They found the rules of engagement and training UAW officers as an important thing. And they also liked the emphasis on the media and creating videos that you would distribute. At that time, that was high tech, was sending out VCR tapes to people for them to watch. But they pointed out problems with the proposal. They said the whole proposal never gave a reason why a worker should vote for union recognition. And then they also pointed out that doing these public relation blitzes in 3 places was a very expensive approach, that you could probably save some money if you did some more selective probing and then focus on one. And then they also pointed out that this embracing of the new UAW is putting the cart before the horse, because they didn't talk to any workers or anybody in the broader community, but instead they came up with this beforehand. And then they also stressed that they thought it probably, you needed to get workers in these places where the factories were to vote for the UAW. So a nationwide campaign may be engaging in a lot of activity that aren't going to help you with your ultimate goal. Now, there's one thing I do want to say before I leave the Laird, Long, and Sylvester proposal, which I think is interesting. And that is, when you look at what Bob King did when he became president of the UAW in 2011, so we're talking, 20 years later, is that one of the centerpieces of what he did was talking about a new UAW. But he did it not in relation to communities in the broader public, but he did it in relation to the firms, where he said that the firms, the transplants, the foreign transplants, had nothing to fear from the UAW, because the UAW was much more cooperative than they were in the past. So you see that new UAW theme resurface 20 years later, and you see a few other things resurface. So this is the second consultant proposal, the 3-team proposal, that they came up with something where, I found it interesting that although they criticized the Laird, Long, Sylvester proposal for putting the cart before the horse, they put a completely different cart before the horse in their proposal. That what they did is they looked at the failed election in Smyrna, Tennessee in 1989, which stressed the wage differences between the big three and the Nissan plant. The one thing they didn't say in the report that in my research, I think, came out even more was that Nissan campaign stressed health and safety. That was actually its lead. So they even didn't get that quite right on what was stressed. But then they said putting wages is not the way to go. And they say it's not the way to go because young rural Southerners are happy to have their jobs and distrust unions. So this report had this vision of young rural Southerners that I find a bit too simplistic and a bit more than a bit condescending. That they said rural Southerners feel inferior to Northerners. It was their assumption going in. We'll see later they define that's not true. And that the arrival of transplants was seen as a psychological boost, that the South could attract serious investment in manufacturing just as well as the North. They said Southerners prefer cooperation to confrontation. Again, one can just think of the civil rights movement, and maybe one could question that statement, but these are the things that they put in there. So the thrust of their proposal was they would argue for unionization. This is their claim on what they would say to the workers on why they should join a union, which wasn't in the first consultant's proposal, to end second-class status that these employees have in the firm. Now, this is sort of a different looking at second-class status, that they argued that what the UAW should say is Nissan, Toyota, Honda, at all their other sites, they have unions. But it's only here in the US that they aren't unionized. And that was the second-class status. Now, it's interesting, again, when one looks at the 2010s, because the UAW makes that argument in the 2010s when they tried to organize when they try Nissan again, when they try Volkswagen, when they try in Chattanooga, when they try Mercedes in Alabama. And they also stress for more this following the rural Southern arguments that union membership is a symbol of status and respect, is their premise coming in. They also came in with a price tag that was lower, a budget of $2 million, and the UAW leadership decided, okay, we're going to do phase one of what this group proposes, and they go ahead with it. So phase one, which cost them about $200,000, was to do a bunch of focus groups. And so they did 2 focus groups at the 3 plants that they identified, the ones that I've been mentioning, the Honda plant in Marysville, Ohio, the Nissan plant in Smyrna, Tennessee, and the Toyota plant in Georgetown, Kentucky. So they do these focus groups, and leaders in the UAW were present when they did these focus groups, not Owen Bieber, but, top people from Detroit were there. And so they do these focus groups, and you have notes of the focus groups that, that Dick Shoemaker took, which are quite interesting. And when you look at the notes, that when they do these interviews and they talk to the workers, the things that they find are that the workers actually do not feel a second-class status at all. To the contrary, the workers in these Japanese plants feel superior to the big 3. Some of this is the corporate mantra that they were fed, and particularly Nissan pioneered this, having monitors throughout their plant that would run corporate information, and much of it, was good things about the company and also things that ran down the big 3 and was critical of the UAW. So these workers felt superior to the big 3, that they felt they were chosen out of, for every 10 workers or 20 workers who applied, they were the chosen ones, and that they were better, that there was more open communication than one had at the big 3 plants. You had, in some of these plants, you had management in the same cafeteria as the workers. Management didn't wear suits and ties. They got some benefits, like able to rent cars at a cut rate, like only management could do at the big 3. So the workers didn't feel inferior at all. And arguments that, the focus group testing arguments on wages, they took, they would argue and show the workers that they were earning, 15 to 20% less than Ford workers or workers in Japan. And in some of these plants, like the Nissan and Toyota plants, some of the workers actually had earlier traveled to Japan for training. And the workers came back in these focus groups and said, well, yeah, in Japan, a beer costs $7. This is back in the early 90s. Whereas here, I can get a beer for $2. So yeah, they're getting paid more, but their cost of living is higher. So their standard of living isn't higher. Our standard of living is at least as good as theirs. So after all these focus groups happened, the second consulting team wrote up a proposal. And in their proposal, their conclusion was no transplant is ripe for organizing. That they decided, they didn't see any of the 3 looked like that there was sort of a wedge issue that would enable them to organize. So their conclusion was, as I have down here on the bottom with recommendations, saying, given these results, one legitimate question is whether it makes sense to abandon the effort to organize the transplants. And then, they said this thing, well, if you stopped organizing, management may get more abusive, and then down the road, that might give you the opportunity to organize. Well, after receiving phase 1, the UAW leadership looked at this, and this was one of the great things about getting the raw boxes from the archive, is I found a number of things would have like Post-it notes and other, things like that on them that hadn't been removed or taken away. And so I found a copy of the report, and I've been reading this stuff long enough that I recognize Dick Shoemaker's handwriting, that Dick Shoemaker's handwriting is distinct because he does these loops instead of dots for periods and for colons. And so on this report, it's, you have Dick Shoemaker writing on a Post-it note, I don't think we need these folks' help at this time. We know what we have to do. And then I've also come to recognize Owen Bieber's handwriting. And down here, we have Owen Bieber writing, I agree, and then file. So, the upshot of this, I'll go back. The upshot of this is UAW leadership, particularly under Owen Bieber, was accused of being complacent and backward and not really innovating. And so the point that I think that I brought home from reading this is, that isn't true, that they were experimenting, they were trying things and exploring things. And the other thing that comes out of this is, these consultants, when they come in, it wasn't like, well, if the UAW was only more creative, they would have solved the problem. And that the consultants, with their expertise in public relations and media, they would have been able to help them solve the problems. The public relations people didn't have any better suggestions than the UAW folks. So, I think the Dick Shoemaker comment of saying, I don't think we need these folks' help at this time, I think he's right. I don't think that the public relations folks gave them anything to help them. Now, we know how the rest of the story turns out, that it was a gap of about 5 years before they tried organizing again. They tried a second time in Nissan. And then it's only really when Bob King comes in that, that you get this big attempt beginning in 2011, 2012 to organize the German plants. And if you want to see the blow by blow and the back and forth and the real detail and some other things that I have, they're in my book. I talk about how in the late 80s, the UAW did organize Freightliner, the truck company in North Carolina, and from the late 80s to the early 2000s. And Freightliner was owned by Daimler. So it was a German-owned company. And so one of the things I do is I contrast the successful organizing drives. They organized 4 major facilities and 3 minor ones in North Carolina. And so a lot of my book, where I look at Freightliner and Thomas Built Buses, which is also owned by Daimler, and contrast that to Volkswagen, Mercedes, and Nissan, is you can see the difference. And the big difference is the Freightliner campaign and the Thomas Built Buses campaign was a direct workplace-focused organizing effort. And the big distinction is there weren't huge subsidies given to build those truck and bus plants, whereas there were huge subsidies given to build the car plants. And the subsidies brought in politicians and gave the politicians leverage and over management. And so you get politicians involved, and in the first organizing drive in Volkswagen, when Volkswagen took a neutral stance, the politicians in Tennessee took the lead in doing a negative drive there. So that nexus that came in, plus you also have the development of something that began in Nissan with Myron Runyon. And that is something I call the union avoidance playbook, with which something we're familiar with. All the tactics, television cameras, captive audience meetings, other meetings, that I catalog them, that you really get that built out and these foreign auto companies were pioneers at this. So one of the, I'll just close with this. One of the arguments I make in the book is when you talk to executives about the US, if you talk to, I did a lot of conversations with German executives, and you talk to them and they'd say, oh, we're just playing by the US rules. And they really see themselves as passive. And I think that's misleading, because what happened because of foreign direct investment is these foreign managers carved out of an industry, the auto industry, a sector that was completely unionized, and have turned it into a sector that is not unionized and has a large section, a majority section, which is now a non-union section by the decisions that they made. So I think the foreign investors are not just passive free riders in the way that they've said. So I'll stop there. I hope it's okay that I decided it made sense for me to go a bit longer, because I may be the only one here. It looks like I am the only one doing a presentation. So I appreciate your patience, and I'm curious on what your questions and observations might be. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I felt very comfortable giving it extra time. I'm private chatting, trying to see if we can find the other speaker, and we have not yet. So let me ask the audience first. I have a couple comments, and if they're not covered, I will make them and some questions, but let me start with the audience.
Hi, Steve. That was a really interesting presentation. And it kind of draws the connection between free trade and kind of this madman advertising era. Do you think our culture changed because of television? And that's why trade unions were less beloved, because they require fighting and asserting your rights and not always being conforming to society. But with advertising, we all want to conform to society. And, we want to wear the clothes everybody wears. We want to wear the cologne and perfume everyone wears. And we're less inclined to stand up and be individualistic.
It's an interesting question. I'd say a couple of things. It was during this period when there was a lot of experimentation with television by the labor movement. And like in the 80s, the AFL-CIO used to produce this half-hour program about labor. And if you could get up early enough on a Saturday morning, you could watch them. And so this was like the early days of cable. And so there was an effort, but without the budget, it really didn't move the needle on the attitudes of people. And there are also efforts that the UAW did that they discussed, and they made some headway on as far as advertising. That there was, I think it was mostly in the 1990s, that they managed to get some companies, Ford and General Motors in particular, to, when they did commercials, to have like 2-second shots. They would have the UAW logo or a UAW flag or something to sort of stress jointness and bring that along. But I don't think it was enough to change the attitude. The one thing that I would say, which cuts a little against what you were talking about, is I do think during this period, if you go from the 30s up to the period we're talking about, you had, in the heyday of the 30s, a very collective generation and a very collective society. And in some ways it was good. You were able to organize unions, and it was very much a working class, we are the working class and they aren't, attitude that helped the expansion of unions in the 1930s and 40s, but that society also had the bigotry with it of, racial, ethnic bigotry, religious bigotry. And when we moved out of the 60s, we had the attack on that sort of bigotry. And I think also you had this melting of class consciousness and the move more toward individualism, to the highly individualistic society that we have today. And with these automobile plants, one of the challenges that the companies have, that the union has, is that they tend to build them in small towns. So that means the workers are commuting like over an hour, sometimes more, like sometimes 100 miles into a town that started with 5,000 people. So it isn't like the old days, and I think of like my grandparents where, my family's from Rhode Island, and where, I had whole, groups of relatives that worked at the Leviton wire plant in Cranston, Rhode Island. And the whole neighborhood worked for the Leviton wire plant. That doesn't exist anymore. And so that makes it that individualization, I think, makes it harder to organize.
Anna, you have a question.
Sorry, trying to, I can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay, thank you for this presentation. It was fascinating. I have two related questions. One is sort of the more global question, is that I was surprised to hear that the first organizing department was in the late 80s at the UAW. And I'm curious, was that standard for the labor movement? Had there been a push to start thinking about organizing in this more structured, sort of a science and an art combined way until then? And then the second question is more granular. I've read that the majority of active members of the UAW today are graduate students. I don't know if that's true, and I would be curious about your reflections on, even though my understanding is that the large membership, given that retirees are still considered members, is still predominantly auto. I don't know if you have any reflections on how that shift happened. Thank you.
Sure. So on that latter question, a majority of the active UAW members are not in automobiles. They're not all graduate students, but they're not in automobile production. So you have education is one piece, but you probably the biggest second piece besides automobiles is still the biggest, but it's not the majority, would be local government, that they have a number of local government people particularly in the Midwest, Michigan and elsewhere. Casino workers, there's a big casino in Detroit. And so that they have tried to organize outside of autos to keep their numbers up. Now, to your earlier question, how organizing happened varied from union to union. It isn't that the UAW had no organizing structure. It's that it was highly decentralized, that it was done in the different regions, and that the regional director was in charge of organizing. So that, and there was no overarching organizational department until the 1980s. And the very first Nissan drive, one of the reasons that led this to happen was the failures of that first drive. You had a fairly charismatic figure in District 8, which was the district for the South, named Jim Turner, who took the lead for organizing. But it was very traditional. It was much more like the tables outside the workplace and things like that. And the other problem they had was when he was doing the drive, he was also dying of cancer and kept it a secret. And so in the end, right before they voted, he died, and so they had to scramble to try to pull things together. So there was a recognition that you couldn't leave it to the locals. And there's a thing, that Leonard Page memo that I showed you earlier on, where Leonard Page, this point one was set up a national organizing department. And his line for it was, just as war is too important to leave to generals, organizing is too important to leave to the district directors. So that there was the recognition that organizing needed to be strategic rather than tactical. Now, the last bit of your question, there was a bit of fervor at the time in the US labor movement to expand organizing, that you had Tom Donahue as president of the AFL-CIO begin to launch. The AFL-CIO did its own Future of Work commission, and this is like the early days of Richard Benzinger working for the AFL-CIO and beginning the Organizing Institute there. And so there was a bit of a recognition at the time that there had to be a more strategic national level contribution to organizing in the labor movement.
I have two observations I wanted to share and have you comment on. I find it striking and really agree that I think the geographic location of these plants was really important, because then a lot of the solidarity was the new job and meeting people together, and the fact that it seemed the unions were counting on the managers to get to be more rotten managers like you're accustomed to, but this new Japanese management style is actually pretty exciting. It was innovative and probably not well understood how compelling and how it spoke to some of those emotional needs of the workers. So I think I've really enjoyed your presentation. I think that's one thing I'm taking from it. But I wanted to comment, and many people today maybe have seen in the New York Times the discussion of the book about the Jack Welch effect, because it's also occurring at a time where Friedman's notion of Jack Welch was kind of lionized as just being ruthlessly efficient, right? And it's interesting that these union companies came in and we had to do things this American way. So I wanted to comment on it if you felt to this move gave additional cover. I think you were suggesting that they were maybe not totally sincere and they had to do it the American way. They certainly could have chosen to do things the Japanese way, more traditional Japanese way, but from a profit motive and all the discussion of Neutron Jack's success from a shareholder point of view, which then really seemed to kick off the income inequality largely because of the success in industries like this or lack of success of unions, but success of anti-union folks. So any thoughts on how those might have been synergistic?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. A pivotal figure in all this is Myron Runyon. Myron Runyon was the first manager of the Nissan Smyrna plant, and it was the second plant to open. The Honda plant had a large cadre of Japanese executives, but the Nissan plant was largely Americans. And Myron Runyon was a many-decade Ford manager, sort of middle-level manager. And he really saw the Nissan Smyrna plant as his opportunity to do the things that he could not do at Ford. And he was originally from Texas and was very anti-union, although he sort of says he isn't when you read quotes, but he was pretty clear he was. And so the thing that Runyon figured out is he took aspects of what the Japanese did, which was building down hierarchies. Like in the very beginning, Runyon used to wear the same jumpsuit that the workers wore and ate in the same cafeteria and gave them the same benefits and had this open door policy saying any worker can come in, to my office at any time, and walk the halls. As I said, was in the cafeteria, and workers were asked him questions, and he answered them. And he took it seriously, and I think that was very effective. And so he borrowed lots of pieces of Japanese management and did adapt them to the US in an effective way. And others copied him after that. Almost all the stuff that's in a contemporary transplant was invented by Myron Runyon.
Thank you. I also, comment I see as Jack Welch evolved and he started then lionizing human resources, the focus on the employee in spite of the, one could argue critically the impact, right, especially on unionization and worker wages, didn't necessarily fit the praise that he gets for the HR, but it was couched in this philosophy, a seductive philosophy that was giving the employees the message they'd want to hear, and if they didn't do the research right, they might not see the consequences.
One thing I'd say, a big contrast between somebody like Jack Welch and what you saw in these foreign-owned plants was Myron Runyon and his successors. They stressed, we're not going to lay anybody off. They stressed, we're going to pay near union wages. And at the Mercedes plant, they still pay the highest wages in any auto plant anywhere. And they rented out Mercedes, at cut rates to the employees. And I've got a quote in the chapter on the Mercedes. The opening quote is from a local steel worker union president saying, it's kind of hard to unionize a guy who drives a Mercedes to and from work. So these, so rather than being neutron Jack and, firing people and selling things off, the thing that these Japanese plants did is they did a core and periphery workforce, where they had the core workforce where they would not lay anybody off. And even, for example, when Nissan was in some really hard times in the mid-90s, where they were making cars and they were parking them in, farmers' fields outside of Smyrna, they didn't lay any core employees off. And only the core employees could vote in a union recognition election. They did lay off the temporary employees. So that tool to keep unions out of having a two-tier labor force was, again, something that was pioneered at Nissan.
Right, and spread effectively, right? You see General Electric and others borrowing, and because they were able to carve out, with the exception of Mercedes, I don't know as much about that, and that's
they have the same thing. They have the two tiers.
But I didn't know that their wages were so high, but it fits with some of the other reading I've done. But they're in a position where they shouldn't need to lay off unless they really had some abysmal market conditions, because they were just starting out such an advantage, right? You might think that 20 years later there'd be the pressure, but then they pioneered the core periphery, which I do think then hides that, right? And so then the focus might have been to look at those most vulnerable, struggling, and I'd say the same thing would be the case at Cal State. I look at the job I have. I'm lucky to be one of the 35% with a full-time job, but we're running the largest institute of higher education. At campuses like mine, 60% are part-time labor making 1/3 of what I make. So, and attention, I don't think it's going to get paid in that, quickly enough, by the union I'm a part of. Okay, well,
true with us, it's, that's happened to academia, to be sure. The other thing that this question of standard of living, it isn't false that when you look around the people who are working at these places, many of them, they were getting minimum wage before, and you read more than one story of workers saying, well, before I got this job, I used to live in a trailer. Now I've got a house and 5 acres and things like that. The one thing that is also mentioned is the brutalness of the work, that some of them want to hang on and, put in 20, 25 years, but a lot of them blow out a knee, blow out an elbow, blow out a back, and you're gone.
Yeah.
But then they're out of the bargaining unit. So.
Well, we have time for one last question. I'll turn the recorder off at 3:45 as instructed. Do we have a last question? Otherwise, I will thank our sole presenter. The first time I've been in a LERA session with only one, but it was a great conversation. I really love the photos. I love the archival presentation. If anybody has any feedback, any praise, this is the time to give it.
Thanks, Steve. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Really interesting.
As I said, keep an eye out for the book. Appear early next year. United Auto Workers attempts to organize foreign vehicle plants in the South.
Okay.
I had a different title before, but I think the editors were right, that this is more like contemporary titles that when you Google it, you'll find it. So
no, it seemed very clear. If I'm looking for that topic, I'll find the book versus maybe a more colorful title that might not guide me. All right. Well, again, thank you, Stephen, for a great presentation. And I will be looking for the book. Was it Cornell Press or what?
Cornell Press. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was Cornell. So get a plug out there. All right.
Thanks
well,
a lot, Thomas.
Thanks everybody for participating in the LERA session. I'll turn the recording off.
Thank you.